All right. We want to welcome you to this evening's webinar hosted by the Nassau-Suffolk School Board Association about state aid budget runs, how to unravel them, how to understand them. And we'll also take a look at the governor's budget proposal and its impact on our region. My name is Bob Vecchio. I'm the executive director for the Nassau-Suffolk School Board Association. We want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. I also want to thank our administrative director, Ms. Lorraine Mentz, who has been working very closely with your district clerks. You see her in the corner waving there. Hello, Lorraine. She's been handling some of the back end logistics for this evening's webinar, so we want to thank her. We also want to thank the executive committee of the Nassau-Suffolk School Board Association and its officers, our president, Susan Littman, as well as our board and service committee, who helps plan all the workshops and some of the webinars that we are bringing you this year. We felt it was extremely important to have a webinar about the state aid runs and a look at the governor's budget proposal, particularly after it was released and it hit hard for so many school districts on Long Island. We felt it was necessary to put something together. We have had over 192 people register for this event this year, for this webinar, and we appreciate everybody's time and attention. We are recording this webinar, and we will send it out to anybody who has registered via email with a YouTube video link for our YouTube channel. And the PowerPoint slide will also be made available on our website later on sometime next week. Once again, we want to thank you for your time and attention. And we'll also say that there is a Q&A box that you could take advantage of and ask some questions as we're going through the webinar. The chat has been disabled, but you should be able to access the Q&A button. That's your place to ask a question as we're going through the webinar, and we will have plenty of time for questions at the end. And we encourage you to ask the questions as you go along. I'll be paying attention to the Q&A box as I work my way through the presentation as well. We also want to thank our webinar sponsor for this evening, ARC Technologies and Matt Pomera, proud sponsors and partners of the Nassau-Suffolk School Board Association. We thank their support for helping support some of the programs and services that we bring you, our members, during the course of the year. I do see a hand raised. If you want to type something in the Q&A, Aaron, that'll be the best way for me to address it. Again, I see a couple hands raised. Again, if the Q&A is not enabled, it's supposed to be, then go ahead and put something in the chat. Our microphones are disabled for the webinar. So without any further ado, I will get going here. Again, our state aid runs were announced a couple of days after the governor released her budget. And shortly thereafter, this is what showed up in Newsday. A complete listing of every school district, the dollar amount of the state aid increase that every school was getting, along with the percentage. Now, a couple of things I will say. The governor announced that she was increasing foundation aid year over year. Long Island was getting more foundation aid than the previous year, which is true overall. And that, record amount of investment in state aid. So all of that is true, but there are some questions as to who got what. And on Long Island in particular, 49 school districts have received reductions in their foundation aid, and 44 school districts have seen outright reductions in overall aid as well. So the devil is always in the details, as we would say. And I want you to pay attention to those numbers down on the bottom, because we're going to get into them a little bit more later on. But again, this is what was reported in Newsday, showing the increase for Nassau and Suffolk and Long Island compared to New York City and New York State. But we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the foundation aid. And I've highlighted here the Copeg School District. And we're going to take a look at how what is represented there in the newspaper article and what your community is reading as far as increases is far from what will be as far as impact for budget development and actual funds that could be utilized. So, like I mentioned, this is about state aid runs and understanding them. This is the actual state aid run, and how it works. And this is exactly what comes out from the state database. This is what is released shortly after a budget proposal is made either by the governor and then there'll be a proposal that comes out when the Senate submits their budget proposal with regards to aid to education, and the Assembly when they send out their proposal. The state aid run in its form that comes out of the state database shows up top is the current year funding levels that you're receiving. So this is what was approved last year. This is the monies that is projected to come into your district this year. That's the first set of numbers up top. So again, if you're looking at a state aid run, this is current year. This is nothing new. The new monies and what gets reported in Newsday is down below here. And that's how they do the year over year comparison for your individual district. And I will tell you, state elected officials, the first thing they do when they know that the state aid runs are out, they start rifling through them, looking up their districts that they represent and seeing who got what, who didn't get what, and what phone calls they can anticipate. For many of our districts on Long Island, across Long Island and in Suffolk, in particular, there were some heavy hits. You know, we heard about Three Village, nearly $8 million, unacceptable overall cut. Long Beach, the Islips, some of our small districts out east, while dollar amount may not have been big cuts percentage wise, it was incredibly hurtful, the governor's proposal. I want to preface this by saying this is a proposal. It's the first step in the process. For those of us that have been around for a while, this is a back to normal budget season for us. The normal course of events, the governor would submit their proposal. It usually had some really bad proposals in there or bad funding investments. And then the legislature would then negotiate things out with the governor. And it's sometimes a far cry from the end product. I will preface this by saying, too, everything that we have heard from our state officials, they have strongly rebuked the governor's proposals for cut to foundation aid for school districts, namely through the method of eliminating Save Harmless, which hurt most of our school districts on Long Island. The Senate Education Chair, Senator Shelley Mayer, she's from the Westchester Putnam area, and she has a lot of influence over the state budget when it comes to education, has been pretty strong in her remarks about not wanting to accept this proposal. And we are counting on the legislature to do their work and negotiate with this governor to take away the harmful provisions of her budget proposal. This would be the look that most of our school board members would give me when our state aid runs came out and our business official puts them on the table at a budget presentation meeting and say, okay, here's our numbers, right? A lot of people don't understand what's sitting in there. So we're going to break it down in very simple, easy to understand terms. And like I said, the devil's always in the details. Some of these numbers are a little misleading, and we need to know how to interpret them so we can communicate them to our stakeholders in the community, comments to local media if we're called upon, but more importantly, how to develop our talking points for our state officials. And we'll cover that later on too. So again, getting back to COPEG, this is, I'm going to use them as the example because they are a very unique situation that kind of goes against everything the governor has said about the changes in her budget proposal and the school districts that she was impacting. So if you were sitting in COPEG and you saw the Newsday article, you're going to see that they're getting an increase of $3.3 million or 3.4%. And most folks might sit there and say, well, hey, that's not bad. You know, I'm sitting in Three Village and I'm losing $8 million and you guys are getting $3.3 million. But watch how this all unfolds for COPEG. Again, an increase of nearly 3.4% or $3.3 million. And this is what was reported in Newsday, right? And what really happened to COPEG, if we look at their state aid run in a different format, expense-based aids, we're going to get into what those are, but I want you to pay attention to this top line. Their foundation aid was actually reduced by $1,265. So for me, they received a cut in aid that was not reported in Newsday. And most people would sit there and say, you got $3.3 million more in money. What are you concerned about? So let's break it down, okay? Again, they had a reduction in their foundation aid. For board members, foundation aid is one of the areas where you get your new money. There's only two areas you get new money from that you can use to impact your budget initiatives, how you craft your budget for the overall cost. You get it with your change in foundation aid and your change in tax levy. As an 18-year board member as myself, I would only look at our foundation aid number changes year over year because none of the other numbers really had an impact on my budget for what we were going to put together as a budget proposed to our voters. And it was the foundation aid change and our local tax levy was our new revenue. That was the money we had to deal with inflationary costs, contract cost increases, if we wanted to bring on a new initiative, how we were going to do it. And it's a little more complicated than that, but for board members, for us, those are the two categories to pay attention to, and I'll explain why. With a 2% tax cap in today's day and age, you are limited at the local level what you can raise, and we are at the mercy of the state. Now, a lot of us have many different levels that we get from state aid. Some of you, maybe it's 10% of your budget. Others, maybe it's 50% of your budget. Some may be somewhere in between. Either way, it's safe to say that we are dependent on state aid, and whatever is not covered in state aid, we either have to reduce in the form of cuts or we have to pass that cost on to our local taxpayers. So in COPEG's case, I will tell you with a 2% tax cap, assuming they don't have any carryover from the year before, and a cut to their foundation aid, they are going to have a gap in their budget planning process if the governor's proposal stands. And they're going to have some tough conversations about where to make up those differences. So let's first look at, well, why is it being said that they're getting $3.3 million and where is that aid coming from? I mentioned earlier expense-based aids. You have building aid. Building aid is the repayment of your capital projects that have been previously approved. Money that's already been spent. Repayment of your bonds and your debt service associated with those past capital projects. Transportation aid, the change in your transportation aid is based on what you spent last year. This is a repayment of prior year expense, right? You could see here the bulk of their increase in expense-based aids is $2.1 million in transportation. This should not be a shock nor surprise to the folks over in COPEG. Now, BOCES aid, again, based on what your bill was to BOCES the previous year, you're just being reimbursed. All these aids are monies that you spent last year. So it's not new money. It's repayment of what you spent last year. And your business officials should really have a good idea. I know there were times that these aid runs came out and my business official would come to me and say, Bob, the transportation aid number is wrong. We know it's wrong based on reports. Keep in mind, these numbers get updated as it gets further in the process in the budget cycle because these numbers are based on financial reports that your business office is sent in through November and they're updated periodically. So keep that in mind. So again, expense-based aids increased $2.4 million year over year. So that is the bulk of the $3.3 million. And again, it's not new money. It's repayment of what you've already spent. If you don't project your cost on a go-forward basis or you have underreporting or problems with reporting, this is where you may run into some trouble. Or if there's inaccurate numbers here because the state has an inaccurate projection for whatever reason, it does happen. But for board members, this is not new money. Now, UPK aid, right? Universal Pre-Kindergarten. This is a grant. This is a pass-through grant. You either use it or you lose it. They received an $864,000 increase in UPK funding. Maybe they use all of it. Maybe they don't. But it's not new money, and it can't be utilized in any way, shape, or form for the purposes of budget planning, budget growth, budget development, or anything like that. So UPK, it's great. It's part of their $3.3 million in increase in aid, and it's true, but they may not be utilizing it. There are school districts that are seeing increases in UPK aid that um, they don't even have the space to increase UPK, much less utilize those funds. So very misleading. So as board members, when we're talking to members of the community and they say, you got $3.3 million, what are you complaining about? Now you know. It's repayment of monies that we spent last year. It's a grant program, use it or lose it. We can't use it for our general fund, even if we wanted to. Already covered that. So, other miscellaneous aids, these are very small, but again, materials for software, hardware, technology, textbooks. Again, these are things that the business office will already have a good idea whether they're increasing or decreasing. They're usually very, very small amounts on an overall budget, but again, not new money, just miscellaneous reimbursements. Um, the one thing to keep in mind that Governor Cuomo was famous for doing in his budget proposals was wanting to cap expense-based aids and not make it based truly on your expenses. And that was something that we always paid attention to and fought back on because, to cap them essentially said, okay, I'm only going to give you X number of dollars. I don't care what you spend, which would be a disaster with transportation aid with how costs have gone up in transportation over the last several years. So if you do the math, you have $2.4 million in expense aids. You also have a reduction in material aids, slight reduction there, right? You have an increase in UPK aid. And if you have the reduction of foundation aid, all of that added together comes out to their increase of aid of $3.3 million. And this is entirely accurate, entirely true, not untruthful when spoken, but the unhidden story there is the cut to foundation aid. So you should keep in mind, too, that if you received a really good increase in foundation aid, congratulations. It's money that you've been owed for 17 years when the foundation aid formula was first put in place. But the governor did something really interesting. She changed, or her staff in their proposal changed one of the calculations for the inflationary index. And instead of receiving a cut of $1,265, COPEG should have received an additional $957,000 in foundation aid increase if she didn't change that formula. The way the current law says, foundation aid inflationary index is based on the previous 12 months of CPI. And if you looked at the 12 months of CPI based on current law, the increase would have been closer to a 4%. She changed it to a 10-year average, and that reduced it from nearly 4% down to 2.4%, thereby giving COPEG a cut to foundation aid as opposed to an increase of nearly $960,000. So they wouldn't have received the cut in foundation aid. They would have received additional funds. So let's say you received an increase in foundation aid of $1 million. I guarantee you're due more. So she's underfunded her promise of fully funding foundation aid by changing a tiny part of the formula. And that is wholly unfair to the districts that have been waiting for these monies for 17 years, right? So again, cut by $1,265. If they increase their taxes by 1%, for COPEG, a 1% increase on their tax levy is $660,000, right? So every 1% they increase, it's 660. So let's assume they go out with 2%. And we're making an assumption they're capped at 2%. They have no carryover. They have nothing that reduces that. That is new revenue of $1,318,735 in new revenue between the foundation aid from the governor's proposal and what they could raise locally. Now, if they had that $960,000 nearly, that would be a big help in their case. Because again, they're underfunded by that current law. And if they had received the 957, this would equate to 1.37% on their local tax levy. This is why property taxes in New York State on Long Island are high, because the state continues to underfund their responsibility for public education through state aid. It's a shame. But again, if you looked at Newsday, Copeg was doing fine. So why was Copeg decreased? Well, the governor has said a lot of schools have a lot of reserves. Well, yeah. The state has a lot of reserves too. She brags about 15% in state reserves, which is $30 billion. Copeg is not over reserved. They're within or under their 4%. They have designated reserves, as is proper, as is what's recommended. And if you don't, then you're going to show up on a comptroller's audit report of being in fiscal distress. But the governor's administration, this is an actual quote that was in Newsday on January 16th. She said, based on reserves and surpluses that many moderate and lower needs districts, meaning wealthy districts, based on what they had, they made a decision to take off Save Harmless because they believe you could reuse the reserves. And listen, if you have a capital reserve, you can't use that for the general fund. It's illegal. You have other reserves. You have insurance reserves. You have compensated absence reserves. So they are targeting school districts that have too many reserves. And they're not even talking about the 4%. They're looking at all of the reserves that schools have prudently put away because we know reserves are an important thing. And an important thing to remember about reserves, ladies and gentlemen, it's one-shot revenue. You can never, ever, as a trustee, use one-shot revenue for reoccurring expenses. The best way to explain that is paying your mortgage with your credit card. You're kicking the can down the road, or paying your mortgage with your savings account. Eventually, your savings account is gone and your mortgage is still going to be there. And then you're in a worse situation, kicking that can down the road. But this is what the governor has said in multiple press conferences. This is what her budget director has said. You know, schools have a lot in reserves. So does the governor. Why did she change the calculation and shortchange those that are entitled to foundation aid? We don't know. I highlight this last line, which is very troubling to me and something that I think we all should keep in the back of our mind. We are trying to raise the dialogue of what is necessary from the state and what is necessary from the district. They're trying to determine how much the state should pay and how much local taxpayers should pay. That's what that statement reads to me. And I'm sorry, but foundation aid was set in law due to a lawsuit that started in 1997. The Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit started in 1997 when the city of New York sued New York State saying, you're not living up to the constitutional obligation of providing a sound, basic, free education to the students of New York. They settled that case in 2006, and part of the settlement was the creation of the foundation aid formula. And the courts put a price tag on what a sound, basic education cost in New York State at that point in time. So this is not something that we've made up or advocated for. This is in response to the courts. So again, that last line is something that got my attention right away because it tells me that they want to shift the cost of education from Albany right on down to the local taxpayers, while at the same time complaining that taxes are too high and housing is unaffordable in New York State. I alluded to this earlier. They took the last 12 months of CPI, which should have been a 3.9% in the index in the calculation behind the scenes formula, and they changed it to the 10-year average of 2.4. This lowered the amount that was due districts for foundation aid by over $420 million. Instead of the $505 million increase that the governor had proposed in her budget, it should have been close to $920 million. I know this slide is very hard to look at. However, we're going to pay attention to this line right here. The change in foundation aid for Nassau, Suffolk, island-wide, that's state aid. But when we look at change only in foundation aid, it tells a very different story. We're still ahead of the state average by a little bit. We're below the average that of the increase that New York City received. So the city received more in foundation aid on a percentage basis than Long Island did as a whole. And that is the new revenue. So more of the new revenue went to some of the urban areas. That's why we've been saying that this battle that our state legislators have upon them is a geopolitical battle, not a party battle, not Republican versus Democrat. It is literally suburbs, rural schools trying to fight for their share compared to the city schools. So, how much foundation aid was lost on Long Island? Total of $43,755,000. The hardest hit, obviously, Suffolk County with nearly 33 million and almost 11 million for Nassau County. 43, almost $44 million taken out in revenue from Long Island schools and sent elsewhere. Those are the true cuts. Those are the districts that received a reduction in aid. There are districts that received an increase in aid. And keep in mind, they didn't get all the aid that they're due. So nearly $44 million has been taken away from our kids here on Long Island, which is why many of us are going to be up in Albany next week, and which is why we're going to give you some talking points for your state legislators when you see them down here on the island. They're well aware of this. And every legislator we have spoken with, regardless of party, across Nassau and Suffolk County, is totally against this proposal. So I'm cautiously optimistic that the Save Harmless will be restored, but we shall see. But these are the numbers that we should be talking to our legislators about and telling our individual district story. If you're a district that has received a cut, if you're Three Village, $8 million means if this stands, this is what's going to happen. If you're in the ISLIPs and you see a cut of $3 million or over $2 million, this is what's going to happen if this proposal stands. Tell the story. How much of your reserves are in designated and undesignated funds? So when you're developing your talking points, as a governance team, you should be working together, board members, superintendents, your business officials, and answer these questions. Are we over the 4%? Maybe you are. Maybe you're over the 4% because of all the federal funds that have been received, right? And you have a plan to spend down those funds, but it required you this year to be over 4%. So if you're over 4%, explain why and how you're going to address it. And if you're over 4% and don't have an answer, I would recommend developing a plan to address that because that is going to be asked. And your legislators are going to know because the governor certainly knows what you have in reserves because we have to report our reserve balances to the state. How much has your enrollment changed? One of the reasons districts are on Save Harmless, you've heard a lot about the removal of the Save Harmless provision. A lot of the reasons folks were on Save Harmless is because of drops in enrollment. I just spoke with a Newsday reporter today talking about shifts in enrollments over the last 10 to 20 years. We've had some districts that have had significant changes in enrollment over 10 years. But to be penalized in 1 year for a change in enrollment over 10 years is unfair. School districts have shifted and reduced cost or shifted cost due to those enrollment changes. Some schools have closed buildings. Some schools have maybe hired more social workers in their school in place of teachers as enrollment has dropped, but mental health needs have increased a lot over the last 10 to 20 years, certainly over the last 10. Security needs have increased. The mental health needs and the security needs are not calculated into our foundation aid formula. These are one of the things we're going to be asking for with a reform to the formula. And that'll be something else we'll talk about. But that is something that our association is working with business officials on Long Island to say we need to reform the formula because it's broken. And here's the things we need to make sure are included in what it takes for a sound, basic, free education. So know what your enrollment numbers have done over the last 10 years and be prepared to say, yes, our enrollment has either increased. Some districts have increases in enrollment. Our enrollment was dropping for the last 8 years. It's stabilized. It's starting to come up. Or our enrollment has dropped, and here's how we have shifted or accounted for the change in enrollment. Again, it could be very well that you've added more course offerings. Maybe you've expanded AP courses. Maybe you've expanded CTE offerings, or you've increased how many social workers you've hired. I know when I was a board member, we didn't have social workers in our elementary buildings when I first got on the board. By the time I left, we had social workers in every elementary building. We have security guards in every elementary building. Those costs have changed dramatically. Know what your district demographics have been. The demographics on Long Island have changed dramatically over the last 10 years in our population. Special ed services have increased dramatically over the last 10 years. E&L learners on Long Island have changed dramatically. So the needs of our students have also changed. We might have less students with higher needs, which increase cost. So that could be a good explanation as to, while you can't cut the aid to us because we've seen a decrease over 10 years and our cost needs have increased. So why penalize us by cutting aid to the tune of $3 million, $8 million in one singular year when we can demonstrate how we've handled the enrollment shift and how we can demonstrate how our needs for our students have changed over the years. These are the things you want to make sure that you have your individual story ready to tell your legislators. So they're telling those stories up in the halls in Albany. Very, very important. Again, how have the student needs changed for learning loss and school attendance and the intervention strategies you put in place post-COVID? It's a big deal. We're making up and trying to make up for lost time as much as possible. These are all changes in resources and your budgetary changes as you're trying to address the academic needs of our students that are very different post-COVID than they were pre-COVID. And that, again, is a shift in cost, even if you've had an enrollment drop. Again, know your district story, highlight your successes, express the areas that you're working on where there's areas to improve, and explain how resources are being invested and how they are paying off and some of the data. Legislators love a good story, they love the data. So work closely with your superintendent and your governance team and your business officials to develop your talking points, right? No lone wolf approaches here. Because anytime you speak to somebody, you're speaking, even if you're an individual board member, you're speaking as part of your team. And your legislators need the facts. They need you to be honest. Because if they're going to advocate for you up in Albany, they want to have the good story to tell, right? So what specifically are our budget asks or our advocacy ask of our state officials based on the governor's proposal? This may change when the Senate releases their proposal and the Assembly releases their proposal, and we'll see what they're doing. But specifically right here, right now, when you see your state officials between now and the time they release their budget proposals, which won't be until March 1st, excuse me, what are our asks specifically? Well, full restoration of Save Harmless, period, end of story. It's a non-negotiable. You can't penalize the districts in 1 year. So restoration of Save Harmless so that these districts that have had these dramatic cuts don't get them. That just gets us back to zero, though. Moderate minimum guarantee increases for all districts that are off formula or Save Harmless. They've done this the last couple of years. Some districts received the minimum increase of 3% because you were Save Harmless, but you still got an increase to deal with inflationary costs of about 6%. Health insurance premiums are increasing at 8%. If you could go back to using the COPEG example, if you can only increase your budget, say 2% locally, and you're getting a reduction on your foundation aid and your inflationary costs are around 6, you got a 4% gap there. Restore the inflationary calculation for the foundation aid. Remember how I told you they switched it to a 10-year average of CPI instead of the last 12 months, thereby reducing what should have been 3.9% down to 2.4. Restore it back to the 12 months. That'll add another $420 million in increases to foundation aid. So those that were shortchanged foundation aid should get what's due, and everybody should get a minimum increase to help deal with inflationary costs. Senator Shelley Mayer even said it during a webinar with the Council of School Superintendents statewide. She said, we have a surplus in our budget this past year. They're projecting deficits going forward, but they always project deficits going forward. There's $30 billion sitting in their reserves. We can't shortchange education. Her comments have been very encouraging. Like I said, she's a very influential leader, particularly with education. And more importantly, she had stated that her colleagues, and what caught my attention was New York State Senator Lieu was in agreement with her, because Senator Lieu mainly covers most of New York City and Queens and a small smidgen of Long Island, but even he was on board with her thought process about the governor's proposal, which I find very encouraging. More importantly, we need to allocate funds to the state education department to conduct a full study on how to reform the foundation aid formula. I already told you it was broken. More than 40% of school districts on Long Island are on Save Harmless now at this point. So that means the formula is not working for nearly over 40% of districts on Long Island. And that percentage is similar statewide. When the formula was first created, nearly 30% of the schools on Long Island were automatically on Save Harmless. So we knew the formula needed changes then. It is in desperate need of changes now. Again, how do you account for the mental health crises that we're dealing with and will be dealing with for the next 10 years in our schools and the costs associated with that? The increases in expectations for security costs of our campuses, keeping our schools safe. The changes in our demographics, particularly on poverty levels and food insecurities. We're calling for them to change the way they measure poverty. There's a better way to measure poverty, and we're going to be advocating for that as well. Urge lawmakers to work with their colleagues in other regions. I said it earlier. This is not Democrat versus Republican. This is suburban legislators coalescing together because this is a geopolitical area, right? If you're in the suburbs or rural schools, rural parts of New York, you're getting hit harder than the city areas are. So they need to band together in a bipartisan way, and it's more geopolitical than party political. So be cautious. Be very cautious because we're starting to hear some rhetoric that is they're going to try to drag us into. We need to continue our fight just on an educational level and for education funding for our own district story. When you're speaking with your state officials, they may ask you to participate in a rally or press conference, which is fine, but be careful of that because if it's seen really, really hard rhetoric that is tying in some issues, and the one issue I heard it, some of us were down in DC this past week. Um, the issue regarding the border and the impact of migrants in New York City. The governor has allocated over $2 billion to deal with the migrant issue in New York City. And politically, some of our officials are linking that funding to the cuts to education. And that is within their rights to do so. But they're looking for us to weigh in on the border issue and the migrant crisis. And I'm not going to profess to know what's best for the border. I'm going to stay in my lane and focus on what's best for education. And you have a priority to fund education. Where you get that money from and how you prioritize it, I use it this way. I have to make sure that my mortgage is paid and there's food on the table for my family before I determine if I'm going to go out to eat, get presents, maybe go play a round of golf that I do very, very badly. I have to make sure those priorities are taken care of. In New York State, the two major priorities based on the Constitution is education and health, which is surprisingly the two biggest items in their budget because that's what they're responsible for. I said it. It's geopolitical. It's not party political. Be very, very careful, but be involved. Make sure your legislators are hearing from you. Make sure the letters that you send to the governor or quotes in the media are factual. Don't go over the top. If the sky is not falling, don't say the sky is falling. But if the sky is falling in your district, it's okay to say that. But stick to the facts. Stay with the facts. Don't get into a huge amount of the what ifs. Stick to the facts. Senator Mayer also encouraged getting parents involved in letter writing too. Just make sure that your parents do the same thing. They're staying within the facts, the talking points that you have developed that impact your district directly. Maybe your impact is you're not getting the foundation aid that you thought you were supposed to get. Maybe you're suffering a tremendous cut, or maybe even a little cut that is really going to hurt your district because you should have gotten an increase. Keep in mind the proposal is step number one. I said it earlier. This is kind of a return back to normal. Past governors have always played with the funding, have initiated a bad policy as the start to lobby, negotiate, horse trade for other things. I call it the Albany budget dance. We're back to the Albany budget dance that we haven't had because of COVID, because of the infusion of federal cash, because of the infusion that the state has stepped up wanting to fund foundation aid to its fullest extent and to finally fulfill the promise after 17 years. So we're kind of back to what the normal was. And I am cautiously optimistic based on what we're hearing from key leaders around the state that her proposal may not stand. We don't know what the negotiation piece is going to be, but that'll reveal itself soon. So this is step number one, but we need to advocate and let our state officials know the impact and tell our story to them. But again, do it factually, intelligently, passionately, without getting into a divisive argument. And it doesn't matter, again, what party they are, Democrat or Republican. If they're from Long Island, this matters. Businesses on Long Island need to know how much funding is being taken away from education, because if it's taken away from education, it is certainly going to impact everybody economically. A good point was just raised in the Q&A chat. It's also an election year for everybody except for the governor, right? Your state senators are up for re-election. The state assembly people are up for re-election. The governor is not. So sometimes the worst proposals come during a governor's midterm. She's got 2 years to worry about re-election. So, you know, get your facts, know exactly how your state aid is running. For board members, again, I want to stress the only numbers that you pay attention to when the foundation aid, state aid runs come out, just pay attention to that foundation aid number. Be aware of what the other numbers are showing and make sure that your business officials are in agreement with what they were projecting those numbers to be. Again, your change in building aid, that should be predictable. You should know when building aid typically comes down every year, right? Because you're paying down your bonds, you're paying down your debt. If it goes up, that's because you maybe completed a project that you finally submitted the cost for. The other expense-based aid, you should have a pretty good handle on when transportation aid is going to change up or down, right? And your business official will probably know if those numbers are fairly accurate because they can predict based on the numbers that they're seeing there how up to date the state is with the financial reports that they're basing these projections on. But for board members, it should change in foundation aid and the new revenue that you're going to get in your tax levy. And those are the funds that you have to work with crafting your budget. There are a million other moving parts, right? You might have retirements and you're going to see savings and change of staff from high paying staff to new staff. And you might see budgetary savings there. But your governance team, your superintendent and the cabinet will have a very good handle on where in the budget they may be seeing some savings that can help in the current year. Maybe you didn't go out with a maximum tax cap the previous year and you have a carryover and that could add another couple $100,000 to your revenue. Have these thoughtful conversations with your team and make sure you develop your talking points and you understand the devil in the details because it's so critically important. Don't get totally intimidated by these numbers and these spreadsheets that could just boggle your mind. Just really, really pay attention to the bottom line for your district. When it adds up at the end of the day, and this is what's reported to Newsday, this is the line we care about. This is the line I've been talking to Newsday about. They say 44 districts on Long Island. 49 districts actually received cuts in foundation aid, and like COPEG here, they're reported in Newsday as seeing an overall increase, which is accurate, but it's misleading because they can't use this $864,000 for their general budget. This money's reimbursed from the prior year. This is their new money, and they get $660,000 for every 1% they raise on taxes. They have a gap. How are they going to address that gap? That's going to be the question that team is probably asking themselves right now. And I'm sure, I know the team, they are definitely using these talking points with their state officials. And their state officials are going to know their story. And that's what we're calling on all of you to do, to know your story and tell your story in an accurate, thoughtful, proactive way so that your state officials who are just about as much against this proposal based on everybody. I haven't heard anybody support this proposal, by the way, from Long Island, regardless of party or who they're representing. But they want stories that when they're debating on the floor, how it's going to impact kids. How is it going to impact your kids? That's what you want to tell them. And again, be aware of some of the cautions that I throw out to you when you're doing your advocacy and teaming up with your elected officials. Again, not going to get into the whole debate about the migrant issue. Stay in our lane. We'll focus on education policy and education funding. That is up to them to know what's best for other policy initiatives and other policy issues. I told a congressman down in D.C. who asked me, he goes, well, I'm going to need your support on this. I said, you're the expert on border policy, not me. We're here to talk about education policy and education funding. So that was my answer, and it's an honest one. So, folks, we are always mindful of your valuable time when we try to put these webinars together. And my goal was to keep it under an hour and allow time for questions. If you have questions right now, please put them in the Q&A chat. I hope this has been helpful for you. And I hope it gave you some information that maybe, you know, I'm being told that the Q&A may not be working for some. So we will try to get your information. You could always email me or contact me. Um, here is, we're not saying goodnight yet, but there's my email. Email me your questions, and I apologize if the chat is not working at the present time, because I am not seeing it. I'm not seeing anything in the chat or the Q&A, and I apologize. And I know some of you probably have questions that you want to ask. I apologize. We'll take it up with Teams as to why it wasn't working. But again, you can email your questions to us. You could also give us a call at the office, 516-781-2053. We're always available. It's best to email, and then we can call you back that way. Just know that we are going to be working very, very hard to push back against this governor's proposal for every district across Long Island, big, small, wealthy, poor, everything in between. It's a bad proposal. She is backtracking on her promise to fully fund foundation aid. It's unfair. We're not going to stand for it. We're going to expect that our state legislators are going to push back and get the Save Harmless restored, get increases to foundation aid where they should be, minimum increases for everybody to deal with this inflationary time period that we're all in, so that we are not penalizing our kids based on a zip code that they live in. And that's the approach that we're taking. So, again, I apologize about the Q&A. I'm going to take this up with Microsoft tomorrow. Suddenly, it just came up. So hold on, let me go through it. On the key ask slides, can you clarify districts going off formula? Sure. So districts going off formula means that you're getting too much money based on what the formula says you should be getting, and you're save harmless. That's what a save harmless district is. Based on the formula, if it was truly to run, you'd actually receive a cut to your aid because you're being overpaid in their eyes. But Save Harmless was put in place because they knew the formula they put together back in 2006 wasn't perfect, and they weren't going to penalize school districts. So since 2007 on, they have held true to the promise that no district will be penalized and receive less money than the year before. The only exception to that was during the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. So if you are off formula, you're a Save Harmless district. So we want restoration of Save Harmless, and this way you may still be off formula technically because you're receiving more money than the foundation aid formula allows because maybe your enrollment has dropped, your wealth factors have changed, Danielle. But we want to make sure you're not penalized for an inadequate formula that doesn't account for mental health costs, security costs, other initiatives, cybersecurity costs, a true measure of a community's ability to pay because they are looking at poverty incorrectly. I'll give you a for instance on that. Poverty is measured with the federal poverty levels. A family of four, $54,000 below that is poverty. Well, we all know if you're a family of four making $55,000, that's poverty for us in our region. And United Way has a thing called the ALICE measure, ALICE, and it's basically a survival budget per region and takes into account regional costs. It's far more expensive to rent in Nassau County and Suffolk County than it is Erie County. And the ALICE measure does a better job of identifying a community's poverty levels than a federal government level. And that's one of the things we're advocating for. And I hope that answers the question with our formula. It's important to note that there is no actual increase in the UPK monies at the state level. It's the same allocation that was made for 23-24. The aid runs, uh, let's see, the aid runs are essentially just showing the difference between what districts actually spent in 22-23, not their allocation versus what the full amount for the 23-24 grant was. Thank you for that, Joel Press. Again, UPK, from a budgetary standpoint, is a grant. So they haven't increased UPK funding. They're just taking a look at what districts spent and saying what they could spend again. So, um, yeah, thanks for pointing that out. And again, the big thing there is just really, it's a grant. Use it or lose it. You can't impact. You can't add to your program offerings. You can't add another elective at the high school with your UPK funds. Okay. I am getting some text messages from Miss Lorraine Mentz, and I want to make sure that I'm answering all questions. Again, if I don't get to your questions tonight, please email me. Um, Folks will tell you I'm up till all hours of the night, and I may respond really late. And the last thing I'm going to say is we're going to be sending out a survey after tonight. It's literally a 2-minute survey. Please give us your feedback on the webinar, how we did, and ideas for future webinars that you would like to see. We're very encouraged with over 192 people registering for this event. So obviously it was something that people wanted to hear about. We have another webinar, a really good webinar coming up in March, and that is crisis and communications during a crisis on March 12th. We hope you sign up for that. We'll be sending information. Don't bother your district clerks about it yet. We'll be sending them information in the near future. I want to thank you for your time and attention tonight. And again, further questions, don't hesitate to email me. And if I don't know the answer, I know a lot of smart people who can get me the answer to get to you. And for those of us that will be joining myself up in Albany on February 7th, please email me if you're going to be up there. And we're setting up some meetings. I got a lot of meetings set up with the state senators in particular, but we'd like to help you out and make sure that we are advocating in one voice, one island, one voice for all of our kids. We have over 420,000 students on Long Island. We have 420,000 reasons why we have to get it right. So with that, I thank you, and we will talk to you very soon. Good luck on your advocacy. And again, don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions or need some tips. We're here to help. We're here to serve, support, and advocate alongside of you. Once again, thank you very much. Have a great evening. This recording will be sent out to folks next week sometime, and the PowerPoint slide will also be put up on our website next week sometime. Thank you very much, folks. Have a good evening.